The wind moved restless across the plains, carrying with it the scent of dust and rain that never seemed to fall. Malachi Brooks stood at the edge of his land, hat tipped low against the dying sun, watching the horizon, as if the earth itself might rise up and try to take back what little he'd claimed. The ranch was quiet now, too quiet. The cattle had thinned. The hands had long since gone their own way, and the great house that once held laughter and voices now echoed only with silence. A man could grow old quick out here, with nothing but ghosts for company. He had promised himself he wouldn't look back, but promises were thin things when the nights stretched long. The war had taken friends, the frontier had taken family, and the land itself seemed determined to strip him bare until he was little more than bone and stubbornness. Yet here he remained, clinging to soil that had drunk more blood than rain. It was near sundown when he first saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving against the far fence line, swaying with a kind of weakness that didn't belong to any predator. He squinted, hand resting instinctively on his revolver, until the shape resolved itself into a woman carrying something heavy in her arms. No, not something. Someone, a child. She stumbled once, caught herself on the fence post, and kept moving, though every step looked like it cost her. Malachi didn't move at first. Out here, strangers meant trouble more often than salvation. But then the child stirred weakly in her arms, and the sound carried across the empty land like a plea he couldn't ignore. By the time he reached her, she was barely standing. Her dress was torn, her boots coated in dust, and her dark hair clung to her face with sweat. The child, a little boy, no older than 4, pressed his face into her shoulder, too exhausted to cry. "You'll collapse if you take another step," Malachi said, his voice low but firm. The woman lifted her eyes to his, and for a moment, he thought she might fall right there. But there was steel beneath her exhaustion, a flicker of something unbroken, despite her condition. "Please," she whispered, "just water. For him." Malachi's hand hovered near his gun belt, old habits refusing to loosen. But the boy shifted again, a faint sound breaking from his lips, and that was all it took. He bent, sliding an arm under the child to take his weight, and nodded toward the ranch house. "Come on," he said, "before the night swallows you whole." The woman hesitated, as though years of mistrust warred against the desperate needs of her son. Then she followed, her steps dragging but determined. Inside the kitchen, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee gone cold. Malachi set the boy gently on the old settee and filled a tin cup from the pitcher. The child drank greedily, spilling half of it down his shirt, but it didn't matter. The life came back to his eyes in small flickers. The woman lowered herself onto the chair across from him, every movement deliberate, controlled as if she'd trained herself not to show weakness. She didn't ask for food, though Malachi could hear her stomach twist with hunger. She only kept her eyes fixed on her son. Malachi studied her for a long moment. Her clothes were plain, travel-worn, but the stitchings spoke of care. Her face carried lines too deep for her age, not from years, but from hardship. And her hands, though blistered and raw, had a gentleness to them when she brushed the boy's hair from his forehead. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Elena," she said after a pause. Her voice was hoarse, like someone unused to speaking freely. "And this is Samuel." He nodded once, filing the names away like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. There was stew left from the morning thick with beans and salted pork. He ladled some into a bowl and set it before her. She hesitated, then pushed it toward her son instead. The boy ate like he hadn't seen food in days. Malachi noticed the way Elena watched, not touching the spoon herself until he slid another bowl her way and gave her a look that brooked no refusal. "You'll be no good to him if you waste away," he said. Slowly, she obeyed. The house was filled with the small, steady sounds of eating, the crackle of the fire, the wind pressing against the windows. For a little while, it almost felt like a home again. But Malachi knew better than to mistake quiet for peace. When the bowls were empty, Elena leaned back, her shoulders trembling from exhaustion. Samuel had already curled against the settee, drifting towards sleep. Malachi poured her a little more water and finally asked the question circling his mind. "Where were you headed?" Her eyes dropped to her hands. "Anywhere but where we came from." "That's no answer. It's the only one I have," she said softly. The silence stretched. Malachi had learned the value of not pressing too soon. Folks told the truth in their own time if they lived long enough. He stood, moved to the cabinet, and pulled out a blanket. "You can take the spare room tonight. Boy looks like he won't last another mile." She froze, her breath catching. He recognized the look, the instinct of someone who had learned never to trust charity without a price. "I'm not asking for anything," Malachi said, "just offering a roof." Slowly she nodded. "Then, thank you." She rose to lift Samuel, but Malachi held up a hand. "Let him rest. I'll carry him." The boy was light in his arms, far too light for his age. Malachi laid him gently on the small bed in the spare room and stepped back, watching Elena tuck the blanket around him with hands that trembled only when she thought no one was looking. Later, when the house had gone quiet, Malachi stood on the porch, smoking in the cool night air. He could hear faint movements inside, the creak of the bed, the soft murmur of a mother watching over her son. His land stretched endless beneath the stars, and yet for the first time in years, he did not feel entirely alone. Still, unease gnawed at him. Strangers did not stumble onto his land by accident. And the way Elena carried herself, the way her eyes had flickered at certain words, she was running from something that might yet find its way here. Malachi drew on his cigarette, exhaling slow into the dark. He had fed a homeless mother tonight, offered her shelter when she had none. But kindness carried weight, and out here, debts had a way of calling themselves due. And he had the cold certainty that by sunrise, the cost of his mercy would come riding hard across the plains. The night settled heavy over the ranch, the kind of silence that presses against a man's chest until he can't breathe right. Malachi didn't sleep. He never did when strangers slept under his roof, and certainly not now, when every instinct warned him trouble was stirring just beyond the horizon. He kept the lamp low in the kitchen, a book open in front of him, though his eyes never moved across the page. Every creak of the boards, every sigh of the wind against the shutters sharpened his nerves. Near midnight, he heard the door of the spare room ease open. Elena stepped out, the lamplight catching the worn edges of her dress. Her face was pale, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and though she moved softly, Malachi could see the weight pressing down on her. She froze when she found him at the table, as though she'd expected the house to be hers in the quiet hours. "I didn't mean to wake you," she whispered. "You didn't," Malachi replied. He set the book aside, meeting her eyes steadily. "Couldn't sleep?" Her lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Not for years." She sat across from him, her hands folded tightly together. For a long while, they listened to the fire pop in the stove. Then, as if she'd finally made peace with something inside herself, she began to speak. "You wonder why I came here?" Malachi didn't answer. Sometimes silence was the surest way to coax the truth. "I wasn't always like this," she continued, her voice low but steady. "Once, I had a place, a family, people who knew me. But the world has a way of tearing those things apart. The land we lived on, it wasn't ours by law, not by the papers men carry in courthouses, but it was ours by blood, by memory, by the bones of our dead buried beneath it." Her eyes lifted to his, dark and unflinching. "My people had lived there long before fences or deeds. A small band, scattered from larger tribes, holding on to what little the wars and the railroads hadn't taken. We didn't ask for trouble, but trouble came all the same." Malachi leaned back, listening. He'd heard stories like this before, whispers of tribes forced off their land, pushed into corners of the world no one wanted until suddenly someone did. But there was something in the way Elena spoke, the way her voice carried both pride and sorrow, that cut deeper than idle tales. "Men came with guns," she said simply. "Said they had papers that proved the land belonged to them now. They burned our lodges, took what little stock we had. Some of our people fled into the hills. Others," her voice faltered, then steadied again. "Others didn't make it." She stared down at her hands, and for the first time Malachi noticed the faint ink of markings along her wrist symbols, half hidden by grime and scar. Not the sort a woman picked up in town. These were older, heavier, tied to something she carried with her even now. "They didn't kill me," she went on, "because they thought I'd be useful. A woman can be traded, bargained, used to buy loyalty or silence. They sold me as if I were part of the land itself." Her words struck like cold iron, and Malachi's jaw tightened. He thought of the boys sleeping in the other room, of how close Elena had come to collapsing on his fence line. "How long have you been running?" he asked quietly. "Too long. Long enough that Samuel doesn't remember what a home is supposed to feel like. Every town we reach, I tell him it's just for a little while. Every fire I light, I know we'll have to leave it behind." She looked up then, her eyes glistening in the lamplight. "But tonight, when you fed him, when you gave him a bed, it was the first time he's slept without fear in months." Malachi felt the words settle heavy in his chest. He had not meant to become anyone's savior. He had only done what decency demanded. Yet decency was a rare currency out here, and maybe that made it more valuable than gold. Before he could answer, a sound cut through the stillness. Hooves, distant but deliberate. Malachi stiffened, rising to his feet in one fluid motion. Elena went pale, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "They've found me," she breathed. Malachi moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to see the faint glow of lanterns bobbing against the night. Riders. At least half a dozen. Too many for chance, too many for peace. "Take Samuel," Malachi said, his voice sharp with command. "Keep him quiet. Stay in the back room." Elena didn't argue. She vanished into the hallway, her footsteps light but urgent. Malachi checked the rifle leaning against the doorframe, his mind already calculating distances, cover, the angle of approach. Out here, a man didn't survive by hoping for mercy. The riders slowed as they reached the yard, the lanterns throwing long shadows across the dust. Malachi stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled but ready, his figure outlined against the glow from the kitchen lamp. "Evening," he called, his voice calm, carrying just enough edge to warn them. "You're a long way from town." The man at the front tipped his hat, though his smile was more threat than courtesy. "Evening to you, Mr. Brooks. We're just looking for someone. Maybe you've seen her." Malachi said nothing. His silence stretched like barbed wire between them. "She's got a boy with her," the writer continued. "Dark hair, tired look. Not much to her, but she's worth something to the right people. You know how it is. Some debts get paid in coin, others in flesh." The others chuckled darkly at that, but their laughter died quick when Malachi shifted the rifle a fraction higher. "This is private land," he said evenly, "and I don't recall inviting you onto it." The leader's grin widened, though his eyes narrowed with calculation. "Now, there ain't no need for hostility. We're offering a fair deal. Hand her over, and you can go back to your quiet life. We'll even forget we saw you." Malachi felt his jaw clench. The weight of the night pressed heavier. Behind him, he thought he heard the faintest creak of the floorboards, Elena holding Samuel close, listening. "You rode onto my land uninvited," Malachi said, his voice dropping lower, colder. "That tells me you're not men of law. That tells me all I need to know." The leader's smile cracked, just a little. He shifted in the saddle, eyes flicking to the shadows around the porch. For the first time, Malachi saw uncertainty creep into the man's face. Because the night wasn't empty anymore. From the tree line beyond the fence, figures began to appear. Silent, unmoving, eyes glinting in the lantern light. At first, the riders thought it was a trick, shadows playing games with their nerves. But then one of the figures stepped forward, and the torchlight caught the curve of a bow, the line of a spear, the hard set of a face that carried the same inked markings Malachi had glimpsed on Elena's wrist. The riders shifted uneasily. Horses stamped, sensing something their masters couldn't name. "What in God's name?" one muttered. The leader swore under his breath. "Hell with this. We'll be back." He yanked his reins, turning his horse sharply. The others followed, their bravado gone, swallowed by the night as they thundered back toward town. Malachi remained on the porch, rifle steady, watching the shadows hold their ground. Slowly, one of them stepped forward, a tall figure draped in dark cloth, face painted with the lines of a people who had survived more than the land ever meant them to. Elena appeared in the doorway then, Samuel clutched tight against her chest. Her breath caught. The tall figure raised a hand, palm open, a gesture both warning and greeting. His voice, when it came, was low, resonant, carrying the weight of kinship. "Sister." Elena's knees nearly buckled, but her eyes filled with something Malachi hadn't seen before. Not fear, not exhaustion, but recognition. Her tribe had found her, and before sunrise, their fate and his would become one. The night deepened, heavy with smoke from the lamps and the faint scent of horses carried on the wind. Malachi stood rigid on the porch, rifle cradled, but lowered now, as the silent figures emerged from the tree line, one by one. They moved with the quiet discipline of hunters who had lived long enough to know the land was their ally. Faces painted with the deep hues of earth and ash. Weapons that looked crude at a glance but were worn with use, sharpened with care. Elena's breath came quick, shallow, her eyes fixed on the man who had spoken. She stepped forward, clutching Samuel tighter against her chest, as though torn between relief and fear. "Darius," she whispered. The tall figure inclined his head slightly. His voice was steady, measured, though his dark eyes flickered with the weight of years. "You should not be here, sister." Elena shook her head. "I had nowhere else to go." The silence that followed was thick, stretching out until Malachi thought it might crush them. Then Darius looked to him, his gaze sharp, unyielding. "You are the one who gave them shelter?" Malachi didn't flinch. "They were dying on my fence line. A man doesn't turn his back on that." Something shifted in Darius's expression, not gratitude, not yet, but the barest flicker of acknowledgement. He turned to the shadows, raising his hand. At once, the rest of the tribe moved forward, stepping into the pale wash of moonlight. Malachi counted at least 24 men and women both, hardened by the road, bound together not by law or paper but by something older, unbreakable. Samuel stirred, blinking sleepily against his mother's shoulder. Elena soothed him with a murmur, though her own hands shook. Malachi could see the war in her eyes, the relief of seeing her kin alive, and the dread of what had followed her here. Darius spoke again, his words low but cutting through the night like steel. "The riders will return. Men like that do not forgive humiliation. They will bring more. Guns, fire, the weight of the town at their back. They will not stop until blood has been spilled." Malachi's grip tightened on the rifle. He knew Darius spoke truth. Out here, grudges were currency, and weakness was an invitation. "They want her," Malachi said flatly. "They want what she carries," Darius corrected. His eyes shifted to Elena, and though his tone was even, there was something in it that made her bow her head. "She holds more than her child. She holds our memory, our bloodline. Without her, we are scattered leaves. With her, we are a root that cannot be pulled from the earth." Malachi felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. He had not asked for this to be drawn into someone else's war, someone else's burden. And yet here he was, standing on the porch of a house that suddenly felt far smaller than the storm gathering around it. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. Darius's gaze sharpened. "We want nothing, but you have given us something we did not expect, mercy. You fed her. You sheltered her child. That is a debt my people do not take lightly." For the first time, the stern line of his mouth softened. "By sunrise, this land will not be yours alone to defend." Elena's breath hitched, but Malachi only nodded once. He understood. Out here, alliances were not forged by treaties or signatures. They were forged by hunger met with bread, by blood shared in battle, by debts that cut deeper than law. The hours that followed stretched long, filled with the quiet preparations of people who had survived too many nights like this. Malachi fetched every weapon he owned: the rifle, the old shotgun, the revolver that had slept too long in its holster. The tribe moved with practiced precision, setting watchfires at the fence line, placing sentries in the shadows, their bows strung and ready. Elena moved among them, not as an outcast, but as one of their own. Malachi saw how they touched her arm, how they bowed their heads when she passed. She was not just another refugee. She was something more, a tether to a people nearly erased. A flame carried through endless dark. Just before dawn, the first sound came. Hooves. Many this time. The earth itself seemed to tremble as they approached. Malachi took his place at the porch, rifle steady, his heart pounding slow and deliberate. Darius stood beside him, a spear in hand, his presence as unshakable as the mountain beyond the plains. The riders emerged from the haze of dust and morning light. A dozen, then 24, their numbers swelling with the weight of hired guns and bitter men looking for coin. At their front rode the same leader from before, his grin cruel in the half-light. "Well now," he called, reining in his horse, just beyond the fence. "Looks like you've made yourself some friends, Brooks. Pity for you they won't last the morning." Malachi didn't answer. The silence stretched, thick as a drawn bowstring. Then Darius raised his hand, and shadows shifted in the tree line. The tribe emerged in full, weapons glinting, eyes sharp. The riders' horses stamped nervously, sensing danger their masters couldn't yet see. "You've brought enough men to start a war," Malachi said at last, his voice cold as the steel in his hand. "But you rode onto the wrong land." The leader laughed, though it rang hollow. "One ranch against 20 guns? You're finished before you've begun." Darius stepped forward then, his presence like stone carved from the earth itself. His words carried across the distance, low and unyielding. "This is not one ranch. This is our ground, and we do not yield." The riders faltered. They had come expecting fear. Instead, they found a line drawn in the dust, guarded by eyes that had seen too much loss to ever step back again. The first shot broke the morning. It came from one of the riders, impatient, reckless. But it was answered instantly. A bowstring snapped, an arrow singing through the air, striking true. The man toppled from his horse, and chaos erupted. Gunfire roared. Arrows flew swift and silent. Smoke curled through the dawn as the battle surged across the fence line. Malachi fired steady, each shot measured, each breath controlled. Beside him, Darius moved like a shadow, spear flashing, every strike deliberate. Elena kept Samuel hidden in the house, but her voice carried through the chaos, calling warnings in her people's tongue, guiding their movements, binding them together. The riders had come with arrogance, but arrogance does not stop a blade. One by one they fell, their shouts turning to screams, their formation broken. The tribe pressed them hard, not with numbers, but with resolve that would not crack. By the time the sun broke fully over the horizon, the yard was littered with the fallen. Those who survived fled in panic, spurred by fear that burned hotter than greed. The tribe did not pursue. They stood firm, their silence heavier than victory cries. Malachi lowered his rifle at last, his breath ragged, his body aching. The land smelled of gunpowder and blood, but it was his still, his and theirs. Darius turned to him, his expression solemn but resolute. "By feeding her, you fed us all. This land is now bound to ours. So long as you stand, we will stand with you." Elena stepped forward, Samuel clutching her skirt, his wide eyes reflecting the rising sun. She looked at Malachi, her voice breaking but steady. "You gave us more than bread. You gave us a place to belong." For the first time in years, Malachi felt something stir in the hollow space inside him. Not just survival, but purpose. The war for his land was not over. Men like those would come again. But when they did, he would not face them alone. By sunrise, a tribe had pledged their lives to his. And together, they would carve a place the world could not erase. If this story of mercy, loyalty, and defiance in the face of greed has stirred you, don't let it end here. Stories like these remind us that kindness is never small, that a meal shared, a shelter given, can change the course of lives, even entire peoples. Stand by what is right, even when it costs you. Protect what cannot protect itself. And when the world tells you to surrender, plant your feet firm in the soil and say this ground will not be taken.